imagine silence. Not the blissful, tranquil silence of an August night, but a different kind of silence. Oppressive. Hot. A silence that presses on your eardrums like the crushing weight of deep water. It rings in your ears, mixing with heavy, ragged breaths and the sound of your own heart, beating against your ribs like a bird against the bars of its cage. The third hour has passed. Or was it the fourth? Time lost its meaning here long ago, turning into a thick, viscous substance measured not in minutes but in degrees of pain. July 12th, 1943. Somewhere up there, above tens of millimeters of scorching armor, the greatest tank battle in history rages on. Prokhorovka is thundering. But down here, inside the immobilized ISU-152 self-propelled gun with the tactical number 312, another battle is being fought. A battle with no witnesses. A battle without a single shot fired, yet far more terrifying than any artillery barrage. 4 men are fighting their final battle not against German tanks, but against a primal element trapped with them in a steel coffin, against the heat. Sergeant Orlov, the vehicle's commander, sits with his back against the gun's breech. He can no longer feel the steel searing through his sweat-soaked tunic. His skin has become one continuous burn, but his brain, trying to protect itself, has shut off the signals. His inflamed red eyes stared, almost unblinking, into the gloom of the fighting compartment. He wasn't looking. He was listening. He was listening to the breathing of his men. To his right, almost crawling under the gun mantlet, the gunner, Zubov, was motionless. The quietest of the crew, a former factory engineer, he still maintained his analytical calm. But even that was beginning to crack. His chest rose infrequently with a wheeze. He breathed through a wet rag, which he periodically moistened with the last drops of water from an empty flask. Water that was now worth its weight in gold. Below, at the controls, mechanic driver Petrenko, the oldest and most experienced, was slumped over. His strong body, accustomed to grease and the roar of the engine, had gone limp like a wax figure. He was whispering something, but the words were impossible to make out. His dehydrated tongue could barely move. And the fourth, Loader Kovalyov, a 19-year-old boy, a cheerful kid from the countryside, the soul of the crew, now lay by the ammunition racks. He wasn't breathing. He was moaning. A quiet, pitiful moan, like the cry of a lost child. He wasn't here anymore. His consciousness was lost in the searing fog somewhere between life and death. The air. It was enemy number one. Thick, heavy, saturated with the fumes of burnt oil, the acrid smoke of smoldering insulation, and the nauseating smell of superheated metal. Every breath scratched the throat, burned the lungs. The temperature inside had long passed 60 degrees Celsius, 140 Fahrenheit, and continued to climb. The engine compartment, separated by a thin bulkhead, had become a blast furnace. Their diesel engine was burning there, and that fire was slowly, relentlessly roasting their armored box, turning it into a skillet. They were trapped, sealed tight. The impact of the shell, which hadn't penetrated the armor, had warped the hull. All the hatches, their only escape, were jammed. Orlov remembered how, in the first few minutes, they had beaten on them with rifle butts, with a sledgehammer from the toolkit, but the steel wouldn't yield. It only echoed with a dull, mocking thud. Then came the realization. Horrifying, cold as a knife blade plunging into the heart. They would not die in battle. They would not be killed by shrapnel. They would be boiled alive. Orlov slowly turned his head. In the dim light filtering through the vision blocks, he saw the ammunition storage. 28 heavy 152mm shells, high explosive fragmentation, concrete piercing, each of them over 40 kilograms of deadly metal and explosives. They were heating up too. The copper driving bands on the casings gleamed faintly. Orlov knew what would happen when the temperature reached a critical point. He had seen what was left of tanks after an ammunition cook-off. Steel torn to shreds, scattered over hundreds of meters. And nothing more. No bodies. No memory. Just gone. And now they were sitting on this powder keg which was slowly being heated from below. It was a matter of time. Another hour. Maybe 2. He closed his eyes. In his tormented mind, an image surfaced, one he clung to desperately, like a drowning man to a straw. His wife's face. Anna. He tried to remember her smile, but it was blurry. The memories were melting, just like everything else around them. But to understand how the crew of a heavy, self-propelled gun became doomed martyrs, how 4 men full of life and hope found themselves in hell, we must go back a few hours. To that foggy July morning, when it seemed a whole life still lay ahead. To that morning, when hell had not yet opened its gates. The morning of July 12th, 1943, was damp and raw. A thick, milky fog clung to the ground, saturated with the smell of wet earth, bitter wormwood, and a distant, barely perceptible scent of burning. The ghost of yesterday's battles. The war had fallen silent for a few hours, as if taking a breath, gathering strength for a new decisive push. The crew of the ISU 152 with the number 312, like hundreds of other crews, was preparing for battle. They were part of a huge steel fist meant to crush the German menagerie, the Tigers and Panthers. Their vehicle, formidable and low-slung, was nicknamed the Zveroboy, the Beast Slayer, by the soldiers for its power and enormous gun. And the crew was proud of that name. They were not rookies. They had battles behind them, had faced the first fear, the first blood, and the first victories. They had become a family, as only those who share a single steel home, a single sip of water, and a single death that is always near can become. The commander, Senior Sergeant Alexei Orlov, a 27-year-old man with tired but firm eyes, was methodically checking the ammunition. He trusted no one with this job. He inspected each shell personally, wiped it with a cloth, checked the markings. There was no haste or fear in his movements, only the calm focus of a man who knows his job. The war had taught him the most important thing. Survival is in the details. A loose bolt, an improperly stowed shell, dirt in the barrel, any of these small things could cost the entire crew their lives. He was not just their commander, but their steel spine. They didn't fear him, but they respected him without limit. They knew, as long as Orlov was calm, everything was under control. Nearby, sitting with his legs dangling into the hatch, was the loader, Private Vasya Kovalyov, the youngest, only 19. Freckled, snub-nosed, he was always telling jokes and smiling, even when there was nothing to laugh about. Now he was cleaning his PPSH submachine gun, lovingly wiping every part, and humming something to himself. "Hey, Commander," he said without stopping his work. "Is it true what they say that the Tiger's armor is so thick our shells bounce off it like peas?" Orlov didn't turn. "Lies," he said curtly. "There's no armor our concrete piercing rounds can't take. The main thing is to hit the right spot, and that's Zubov's job." The gunner, Sergeant Ivan Zubov, sitting at his station inside the vehicle, just grunted at these words. He was nearly 40. Before the war, he worked as a design engineer at the Kirov plant. He knew this machine not as a soldier, but as its creator. He could feel every one of its mechanisms. Right now, he was working his magic on his panoramic sight, wiping the lenses with a piece of chamois, adjusting something, striving for perfect clarity. His reticence and phlegmatic nature were the subject of Kovalyov's constant jokes, but everyone knew, when it came to shooting, Zubov had no equal. They called him the jeweler. Down below, in the driver's compartment, the mechanic driver, Starshina Grigory Petrenko, was busy. The oldest of the crew, he was already over 50. An experienced tractor driver, he knew diesel engines like the back of his hand. He had fought in the Winter War and treated the war with the fatalistic calm of a man who had seen it all. He grumbled at the engine as if it were a stubborn horse, but he loved it. Their lives depended on his work. The ability to get out from under fire in time, to change position, to evade a hit. "Well, old girl, you won't let me down today, will you?" he muttered, checking the oil level. A tense anticipation hung in the air. Everyone understood. Today was going to be hot. Reconnaissance reported a concentration of hundreds of German tanks. Soldiers whispered fearsome names to each other. Tigers, Panthers, Ferdinands. This wasn't just another attack. This was the decisive battle, and everything depended on its outcome. Around 9 in the morning, the fog began to lift. Breakfast was passed down the line. Bread, a piece of lard, and mugs of hot, watery tea. They ate in silence, concentrating, each lost in his own thoughts. Orlov thought about the order that was due any minute. Kovalyov thought of a girl from a neighboring village who promised to wait for him. Zubov was mentally calculating trajectories and lead times for firing at moving targets. And Petrenko was simply enjoying the hot tea, thanking God for another quiet hour. He pulled a worn, 4-folded letter from his daughter out of his breast pocket. He had reread it 100 times, but each time a warm smile appeared on his weathered face. He didn't know yet that this would be the last time he would read it. At 9:30 in the morning, the roar of a flare rocket shattered the silence. The artillery preparation began. Thousands of guns on both sides spat tons of deadly metal into the sky. The ground trembled and moaned. The air thickened with the roar. "To your stations," Orlov commanded curtly. The crew took their positions. Kovalyov rammed the first high-explosive fragmentation shell into the breach. Petrenko started the engine. The steel heart of their beast slayer began to beat steadily and powerfully. The machine came to life. Through his periscope, Orlov saw the first silhouettes of German tanks appear over the hill. There were many of them. Dozens. They were advancing in perfect formation, as if on parade. At that moment, he didn't yet know that in an hour, their world would shrink to the size of this steel box. He didn't know that their main enemy would not be a tiger, but their own crippled machine. He gave the last order in that former world. "Petrenko, forward. Zubov, target. Lid tank. Fire." The battle was a waking nightmare. The air thickened to the consistency of jelly, pierced by shell tracers, smoke, and screams. The earth shook from explosions, bucking and heaving, showering the armor with clumps of black, greasy soil. Inside the ISU-152, it was cramped, stuffy, and deafeningly loud. Each shot from their own 152mm gun was like a sledgehammer blow to the head, knocking the air from their lungs for a few seconds and plunging the fighting compartment into acrid powder smoke. But they worked. They worked like a single well-oiled machine, where each man knew his part. "Target, Panther. Distance 800 meters, about 875 yards," came Orlov's calm voice through the headset. "I see the target," Zubov responded, his eyes glued to the sight's eyepiece. His hands seemed to find the right handwheels on their own, smoothly aligning the crosshairs with the dark silhouette of the enemy vehicle. "Fire!" Orlov commanded. "Firing!" Kovalyov shouted, pulling the trigger lever. A roar. Recoil! The spent casing flew out of the breach with a clang, blasting everyone with a wave of hot air. And immediately, without losing a second, Kovalyov, straining every muscle, dragged a new, heavy shell from the ammunition rack and rammed it into the gun. Petrenko, guided by the commander's orders and rare glances through the vision slits, drove the machine, maneuvering between craters and the hulks of burning tanks. Their beast slayer was living up to its name. With their very first shot, they turned a German Panther into a blazing torch. A second, armor-piercing round tore the turret off a Pizik PFW-4. They felt invincible in their steel fortress. The armor of their SPG held, and smaller caliber shells ricocheted off it with a piercing screech, leaving only scratches. But hell was closing in. At some point, they found themselves in the very center of the battle. Enemy tanks were everywhere. Shells were now drumming against the armor non-stop. The vehicle was shaking, being thrown from side to side. Orlov, trying to shout over the din, gave commands. They knocked out another tank and a Stug self-propelled gun. Luck seemed to be on their side. The catastrophe happened suddenly. It wasn't a direct penetrating hit, rather a deafening, crushing blow to the side, as if from a gigantic hammer. The entire 27-ton machine shuddered to its foundations. The men were thrown around the fighting compartment like peas in a box. Orlov was slammed against the breech, Zubov against the sight. Kovalyov fell onto the shells. A ringing in their ears drowned out all other sounds. An unnatural silence fell. And then the engine died. Its steady, familiar roar, the soundtrack of their lives, was replaced by a grinding noise and then complete silence. "Petrenko, what's with the engine?" Orlov rasped, coming to his senses. No answer. "Petrenko!" he shouted. "It won't start, Commander." The mechanic driver's muffled voice finally came through. "Something's wrong with the fuel system. And I think there's a fire." A fire. The words sounded like a death sentence. Orlov looked at the bulkhead separating them from the engine compartment. A thin stream of black, acrid smoke was already seeping from under it. "Everyone, abandon the vehicle. Now," he commanded, lunging for the commander's hatch. He turned the handle. Nothing. He threw his whole body against it. The hatch didn't budge a millimeter. "It's jammed!" shouted Kovalyov, who was already trying to open his loader's hatch. The same result. Zubov and Petrenko, having climbed out of their compartments, joined them. They beat on the hatch covers with anything they could find. First with their fists, then with the butts of their submachine guns. Orlov grabbed a sledgehammer from the toolkit and brought it down with all his might on the locking mechanism. The steel responded with a dull, mocking boom. Nothing. They were locked in a steel box, with a fire in the engine compartment. Outside, the battle raged on. They could hear shells continuing to strike their armor. They were a perfect, immobile target. But that wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was inside. The smoke was getting thicker. It was becoming hard to breathe, and they felt the heat. Not intense yet, but steadily growing, coming from the engine bulkhead. It came in waves like the breath of a giant beast. All four of them froze, looking at each other. In their eyes, desperation slowly gave way to a primal, animalistic terror. The realization of what awaited them. They understood. They had fallen into a trap. Orlov looked at his terrified, choking men, then at the massive, jammed hatch. And in that moment, he knew there would be no rescue from the outside. No one would come to their aid in the middle of this hell. If they wanted to survive, they had to fight for themselves. And he had to be more than just a commander to them. He had to be their last hope. "Cut the panic!" His voice was firm, almost harsh, cutting through the growing roar of the fire and Kovalyov's moans. "Fire extinguishers! To the bulkhead! Move!" The first few minutes descended into chaotic, desperate struggle. The shock of realizing they were trapped mixed with the instinctive desire to act, to do something. Kovalyov and Zubov ripped 2 standard-issue carbon tetrachloride fire extinguishers from the walls and aimed their nozzles at the gaps near the engine bulkhead, where the thickest smoke was pouring out. With a hiss, a caustic, suffocating jet shot out from the cylinders. The fighting compartment instantly filled with tetrachloromethane fumes, a toxic substance that, upon contact with hot metal, turned into phosgene, a chemical warfare agent. Breathing became nearly impossible. Their eyes watered, their throats burned, inducing gag reflexes. Every breath was torture. "Enough!" Orlov yelled, pulling Kovalyov away from the bulkhead. "We'll suffocate before we burn." The extinguishers were empty, but it had done no good. The fire in the engine compartment was too strong. They had only added poisonous fumes to the heat and smoke. Hell had just become more refined. The crew froze in exhaustion. Panic receded, replaced by a heavy, oppressive apathy. They sat on the cool, for now, floor, breathing heavily, and listened to the fire raging behind the bulkhead. The sound, a steady, monotonous roar, penetrated their very consciousness, paralyzing their will. It seemed as if that roar was death itself. The temperature continued to rise. Outside, the battle still thundered, but now those sounds seemed distant, unreal, as if coming from another world. Their world had shrunk to these few cubic meters of steel space. It became hot. Not just stuffy, but truly hot. The shells in the ammunition rack, which had been cooled to the touch half an hour ago, were now warm. The floor under their feet, closer to the engine compartment, was already searing. The air grew drier and hotter. They began to feel thirsty. At first a slight thirst, then an increasingly nagging, tormenting one. Kovalyov took out his flask, took one greedy gulp, and immediately started coughing. The water felt like boiling water. Orlov took the flask from him. "Conserve it. We don't know how long we'll be in here." "What difference does it make, Commander?" Kovalyov rasped, his eyes shining with a crazed light. "We're all going to burn anyway. We have to get out. Break the hatch." "Break it with what?" Orlov asked calmly, though his own heart was pounding like a mad thing. "We already tried. There are Germans outside. If we open the hatch, they'll cut us down instantly." "Better a bullet than this," Kovalyov screamed. "To be cooked alive. Do you understand what's waiting for us?" He was on the verge of hysterics. His young body, his psyche, couldn't withstand this ordeal. Orlov knew that panic was as much their enemy as the fire. If one of them broke, it would spread like a disease to the others. And then, the end. He walked over to Kovalyov, placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, and forced the boy to look him in the eye. "Listen to me, soldier. We are a crew. We will survive. All of us, together. Understood? As long as I'm alive, no one gives up and no one goes insane. Breathe. Slowly." His calm, confident voice had an effect. Kovalyov stopped screaming, went limp, and began to cry softly like a child. Orlov looked around at the others. Petrenko sat with his face in his hands, praying. He, an old communist who had always laughed at priests, was now whispering long-forgotten words of prayer. Only Zubov maintained an outward calm. He wasn't sitting idly. He was methodically scanning the fighting compartment as if looking for a solution. His engineer's eye caught on every detail: the wiring, the ventilation system, the water tanks. Orlov ordered everyone to take off their tunics and remain in their undershirts. This provided only momentary relief. Sweat poured off them in streams, instantly evaporating in the scorching air. Their skin became sticky and hot. Every hour, their prison heated up by another few agonizing degrees. They sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. They remembered home, their families, a life of peace. These memories were both a salvation and a torture. They gave them the strength to hold on, but at the same time, they underscored the full horror of their present situation. Another hour passed. Breathing became more and more difficult. The air wasn't just hot, it was heavy, dead. There was less and less oxygen left in it. They began to feel the first signs of oxygen deprivation: dizziness, weakness, a pounding in their temples. Orlov realized that the heat was a slow death, but asphyxiation would kill them much faster. They were suffocating. And just then, when it seemed that all was lost and all that was left was to wait for the inevitable, Zubov's quiet, hoarse voice broke the oppressive silence. "Commander, the water in the drinking tank and in the gun's cooling system." Zubov's words sounded like a revelation. For the first few seconds, no one even understood what he was talking about. Water? Why did they need water if they were suffocating? But the gunner's engineering analytical mind was already working at its limit, searching for an unconventional solution in a seemingly hopeless situation. "We're not going to drink it," Zubov continued, his voice weak but firm. "Drinking won't save us. We'll lose consciousness from suffocation before we do from dehydration. But if we soak rags and breathe through them, the moist air will filter some of the soot. And it cools the air we inhale. We'll buy ourselves time." It was a brilliant idea in its simplicity, a truly unexpected weapon born of desperation and knowledge. Orlov instantly grasped its value. It was a chance. A faint, fragile one, but a chance nonetheless. "Petrenko!" he commanded, a commander's tone returning to his voice. "Get the drinking water tank over here. Kovalyov, tear up the shirts into rags." The crew began to move again. Apathy retreated in the face of hope. Petrenko, grunting, unscrewed the fastenings of the small 10-liter tank. It was a little more than half full. Precious liquid that now held the price of life. Kovalyov, forgetting his tears and fear, viciously tore his tunic and undershirt into strips. Zubov, fighting through his weakness, was already unscrewing the tap on the barrel's cooling system tank. It contained a special fluid, a mix of water and glycerin, but in this situation, that didn't matter. Orlov took the first rag, dipped it in the tank, and brought it to his face. He inhaled. Cool, moist air filled his burning lungs. It was an indescribable relief, like a sip of life in a desert of death. He passed the wet rag to Kovalyov, then to Petrenko. Zubov had already made a mask for himself. For a few agonizing minutes, an almost blissful silence reigned in the fighting compartment, broken only by greedy, hoarse gasps. They had defeated the first enemy, immediate suffocation. It was their first victory in this hellish trap, a victory that instilled in them a fragile but desperate hope. They realized that they could fight back, that even in this steel coffin there were laws of physics and chemistry that could be used to their advantage. But the euphoria was short-lived. There was catastrophically little water, only about 15 liters for the four of them. And the scorching air dried the rags instantly, forcing them to be re-soaked again and again. Every drop counted. Orlov knew they needed a system, a rigid, merciless system of survival. He took control of the water. "Listen to my order," he said firmly. "Water is life. We will use it only on my command. We wet the rags every 10 minutes, not a drop more. Drinking is forbidden. If anyone disobeys this order, I will shoot him on the spot." He spoke the last words without any drama. As a matter of fact, and everyone understood he wasn't joking. In these conditions, the laws of peacetime did not apply. Only one law was in effect here, the law of survival, and Orlov was becoming its guarantor, its supreme judge. They had defeated suffocation, but the red-hot armor continued to breathe heat. The temperature didn't drop, it only rose. Their wall-mounted thermometer already showed 65 degrees Celsius, 149 Fahrenheit. The bulkhead separating them from the engine had turned cherry red. It was impossible to touch. They sat huddled together in the front of the vehicle, as far as possible from this hellish source of heat. But the heat was everywhere. It radiated from the walls, from the ceiling. It penetrated every cell of their bodies. They were sitting in a convection oven, and just at that moment, when it seemed they had found a fragile balance that allowed them to breathe and live, they heard a new sound. A quiet, barely audible sound, but all the more sinister for it. It was something like a faint click or a soft ping. The sound was coming from the direction of the ammunition rack. Orlov slowly turned his head. Zubov and Petrenko also froze, listening. Kovalyov, it seemed, didn't hear. He was in a state of semi-consciousness. Click, and another one. Orlov, as the most experienced, understood first. It was the sound of metal expanding from the heat. It was their shells. 28 high-explosive bombs, slowly but surely approaching their detonation temperature. Their first victory had turned into the realization of an even more terrible threat. They were on a timer, and they had no idea how much time was left on it. The realization that they were sitting on a powder keg that was slowly heating up changed everything. If before their struggle was for survival, now it had turned into a race against time. The fear of suffocation was replaced by the sticky, chilling terror of an imminent explosion. Every click coming from the ammunition rack was a blow to the heart. Time began to flow differently. Every minute felt like an eternity, yet at the same time, they knew that they had fewer and fewer of these minutes left. Orlov, understanding that panic could destroy them faster than any explosion, decided to act. He had to create a system, an empire of order in this microscopic hell. He had to occupy their minds and hands so they wouldn't have time to think about death. "All right, listen up." His voice was as hard as steel. "We don't know when it will happen. Maybe in an hour. Maybe in 5. Or maybe it won't happen at all. But we are not going to sit here and wait. We are going to fight." He established the laws of their small world. Harsh, almost prison-like, but necessary. He created a daily routine, although outside their box night might have already fallen. He assigned roles. "Zubov, you're our engineer. Think. Think about how we can cool the ammunition, even by 1 degree. Any idea. The craziest one. Petrenko, you're in charge of the men's condition. Make sure no one passes out. Talk to them. Don't let them fall asleep. Kovalyov, you will help me with the water." He appointed himself the guardian of their most precious resource, water. He poured all the liquid into a single container, an empty shell casing plugged with a rag. He established a strict schedule, 1 sip for each man every hour and wetting the rags every 15 minutes. He became a dictator, and everyone obeyed him without question, because his dictatorship was their only chance. They began to work. Zubov, fighting the heat and weakness, crawled near the ammunition rack, feeling the shells. They were as hot as baked potatoes, he thought. How to dissipate the heat? He tried to cover the shells with wet rags, but they dried instantly, having no effect. He tried to create some sort of ventilation by waving a piece of canvas, but in this scorching air, it was pointless. Petrenko, following orders, nudged Kovalyov, who had sunk into apathy. "Hey, Vasya, remember how in the village we—" He began to tell some story from his peaceful life, forcing the boy to listen, to respond, not letting him sink completely into the merciful but deadly oblivion. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm, governed by Orlov's commands and the ticking of an invisible timer. They were no longer soldiers. They had become inhabitants of a strange, surreal world. Their shelter, their prison, became their home, their Noah's Ark, and the altar upon which they were being sacrificed to the god of war. They got used to the heat, the pain, the constant thirst. The human body has an amazing capacity for adaptation. But the psyche is a much more fragile thing. Perhaps 3 hours had passed since the hit. The temperature had reached 70 degrees Celsius, 158 Fahrenheit. The air shimmered as if over a bonfire. It was painful to look. Breathing without a wet rag was impossible. Their bodies were at their limit. But the worst was the psychological pressure. The constant anticipation of the explosion was driving them mad. And the first to break was the weakest among them, Kovalyov. He had been lying silently for a long time, staring at one point with unseeing eyes. And then he spoke, quietly, almost in a whisper. "I don't want it to be like this," he whispered. "I don't want to be blown to pieces. I want to be buried in the ground, so my mother can visit my grave." Petrenko tried to calm him, but Kovalyov wasn't listening anymore. He was in his own world, the world of his fear. "We have to open it." His voice began to grow stronger. "We have to surrender. They won't kill us. We're tankers. They'll take us prisoner. But this isn't death. This is hell." "Silence, Kovalyov!" Orlov cut him off. "That's an order!" But it was too late. The contagion of fear and desperation had already begun to spread. Petrenko looked at Orlov with a plea in his eyes. Even in Zubov's firm gaze, a flicker of doubt appeared. What if the boy was right? What was better? A certain agonizing death here, or a slim chance of survival in captivity? The perfect order created by Orlov, his empire from nothing, had cracked. In the darkness of their steel coffin, a mutiny began to brew. A mutiny not against their commander, but against fate. A mutiny of despair. The conflict, which until this moment had been smoldering under the ashes of fear and discipline, erupted with unexpected force. Kovalyov's voice, the voice of desperation, became the catalyst. "Commander, maybe he's right." Petrenko suddenly spoke up, averting his gaze. "How much longer can we last? An hour? 2? The shells will go off, and there won't be a trace of us left. But this way, at least there's some chance." Orlov silently looked at them, at Kovalyov, whose eyes burned with a mad fire, at Petrenko, the old soldier, broken by the prospect of a horrific death, even at Zubov, who remained silent, but his silence no longer held its former conviction. He understood them. Oh, how he understood them. He himself fought every second against the urge to smash that damned hatch and jump out into the bullets, just to end this unbearable torture by heat. But he was the commander. Their lives rested on his shoulders, and he knew something that, in their desperation, they refused to understand. "Prisoners?" Orlov chuckled bitterly, his chapped lips twisted. "Do you know what they do to the crews of the Beast Slayers? They hate us. They fear us. To them, we're not soldiers. We're the destroyers of their precious big cats. They won't take us prisoner. They'll shoot us on the spot as soon as we stick our heads out. Or worse, burn us alive with a flamethrower." He spoke calmly, but his words, like ice-cold water, cooled their hot heads. But not Kovalyov's. His mind had already refused to accept logic. He was in the grip of irrational terror. "You're lying," he screamed, jumping to his feet. He swayed from weakness but stayed upright. "You're just scared. You want us all to die in here with you. But I want to live. To live! You understand?" He lunged for the commander's hatch, trying again to turn the jammed lever. It was madness. Orlov acted instantly. He couldn't let him open the hatch, not only because they would be killed immediately. The influx of fresh air, of oxygen into their red-hot box would turn the smoldering fire in the engine compartment into a roaring furnace. They would be incinerated in seconds. He jumped on Kovalyov, pulling him away from the hatch. A struggle began, a desperate, absurd struggle between two exhausted, half-dead men in the scorching darkness. They rolled on the hot floor, delivering weak, clumsy blows to each other. Petrenko and Zubov watched, frozen in horror. Their small world, their empire, was collapsing before their eyes. Orlov was stronger. He pinned Kovalyov to the floor, sitting on his chest. The boy struggled, screaming something incoherent, scratching. Orlov had to hit him, once hard, on the jaw. Kovalyov went limp and fell silent. He didn't lose consciousness. His strength simply ran out. He lay on the floor and wept quietly, no longer hysterical, but helplessly and pitifully. In the ensuing silence, only Orlov's heavy breathing and Kovalyov's soft sobs could be heard. The mutiny was suppressed. Orlov had upheld his law. He got up, swaying. He looked at Petrenko, at Zubov. In their eyes, there was fear, but also respect. They once again saw him as their commander, the rock against which the wave of despair had crashed. But while they were sorting things out among themselves, their true, faceless enemy, the heat, continued its work. And it was at this moment that fate dealt its final blow. The clicking from the ammunition rack stopped. In its place, a new sound emerged, a sound unlike any other. A drawn-out, high-pitched moaning sound, as if someone were drawing a bow across a taut metal string. It was the sound of metal reaching its elastic limit. It was the casings groaning, ready to rupture at any moment and release the power locked within them. Zubov, the engineer, understood it first. He slowly raised his head and looked at Orlov. His face was as white as a sheet. "Commander," he whispered, with his lips only so Kovalyov wouldn't hear. "This is it. It's pre-detonation heating. We have minutes left, maybe even seconds." Zubov's words were not a cry of panic. They were a calm, cold statement of fact, like a doctor's diagnosis at the bedside of a terminally ill patient. And that made them all the more terrifying. Minutes. Seconds. Time compressed into a single point where everything converged, the past, the present, and a future they no longer had. All their heroic efforts, all their struggle, the entire system Orlov had built, it all lost its meaning in the face of an inescapable physical reality. The explosives inside the shells had reached a critical temperature. What came next was a chain reaction, and an instantaneous, blinding oblivion. In that moment, something changed. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was gone. The pain was gone. All that remained was a crystal clear, deafening silence in the mind. Acceptance arrived. Orlov looked at his crew one last time. Petrenko sat, hugging his knees, staring into space. He wasn't here anymore. He was there, in his village, with his daughter. Zubov, having overcome the initial shock, was methodically, as he had done his whole life, wiping the eyepiece of his sight with a piece of chamois, a meaningless, ritualistic act that helped him preserve the last vestiges of his sanity. Kovalyov lay motionless on the floor, his chest barely rising. He was the closest to death, and perhaps it was easiest for him. Orlov closed his eyes. He didn't think of his wife, didn't reminisce about his peaceful life. There was only one thought in his head, full of bitter irony. I failed. I couldn't save them. He had let his men down. He had given them hope, made them fight. But in the end, he had only prolonged their suffering. But then something awoke in Kovalyov, who had seemed completely broken. A final, irrational, animalistic impulse for life. He could not accept it. He could not accept this horrible death. With an inhuman scream, a mix of rage, fear, and desperation, he jumped up again, but this time, he didn't rush to the hatch. He grabbed the sledgehammer. His eyes were wild. "I won't burn!" he roared. "I won't burn!" He swung the sledgehammer, aiming for the ammunition rack. It was absolute madness. He wanted to hasten the end, to choose a quick death over the slow wait. Orlov reacted instinctively. He threw himself in the way. If Kovalyov hit the fuse, the detonation would be instantaneous. He gripped the handle of the sledgehammer, trying to wrench it away. They were locked in a desperate struggle again, but now, not minutes but moments were at stake. And at that very moment, when all the colossal energy of their despair, their struggle, their fear was concentrated in a single point, in this physical confrontation, the impossible happened. A miracle. Or perhaps just a law of physics. The vehicle's hull, deformed by the initial shell impact and heated to extreme temperatures, was under tremendous stress. Every molecule of metal was vibrating, ready to rupture. And the powerful blow that Kovalyov and Orlov, in their struggle, delivered to an internal bulkhead became the final straw. There was a sharp, deafening crack, nothing like the previous ones. It was as loud as a pistol shot, and immediately after it, a screech. The struggle stopped. All four men froze, staring at a single point, at the small infantry escape hatch in the floor of the vehicle, intended for emergency evacuation. It was always considered unreliable. It often jammed even under normal conditions. And it was this hatch, deformed and forgotten, that at this moment buckled. The metal, unable to withstand the stress, ruptured along a weld seam. And between the hatch cover and the hull, a thin gap appeared, the width of a finger. A beam of light shot out from it. Dusty, dim, but unbearably bright to their eyes, accustomed to the gloom. And with it a stream of air burst into their searing hell. Fresh, cool, smelling of dust and freedom. It was salvation. Unexpected. Impossible. Hard won. They stared at this thin strip of light as if it were the face of God. But did they have time to use it? The gap was their salvation and their curse. The fresh air that rushed in was like a balm to their burned lungs, but at the same time, it could be the catalyst for the explosion. There was no time to think. "Everyone out!" Orlov screamed, his voice breaking. "Now!" He was the first to scramble to the hatch. He gripped the edge of the cover with his fingers. The metal was hot, but he felt no pain. He pulled, straining with his last bit of strength. Zubov rushed to help him. Together they managed to bend the edge of the cover another few centimeters. The opening was narrow. Only one person could squeeze through, and even then with difficulty. "Kovalyov, get out!" Orlov commanded. But Kovalyov didn't move. He lay on the floor staring at them with empty eyes. He wasn't here anymore. His mind had remained behind in the hell from which there was no exit. "Petrenko, help me!" Orlov and Petrenko dragged Kovalyov's limp body to the hatch and began to push him out. It was incredibly difficult. Their strength was nearly gone, but adrenaline and the will to live worked miracles. They pushed him out. Petrenko went next. He squeezed through the narrow gap and tumbled out. "Zubov, go!" Orlov yelled. The engineer, without wasting a second, slipped through the opening. Only Orlov was left. He cast one last glance at the fighting compartment that had been their prison and their purgatory. The shells in the ammunition rack were now glowing with a dull, cherry-red light. He realized he had seconds left. He dived into the hatch, tearing his shoulders and back to bloody shreds on the sharp edges of the metal, and at the very moment his legs were outside, the explosion occurred. They weren't thrown by the blast wave. They were lying too close, right under the belly of the beast. They felt it differently. The ground beneath them shuddered as if in an earthquake. The air instantly became as hot as a blast furnace, and then a shower of red-hot shrapnel and burning oil rained down on them. They were lying on the scorched black earth next to their own funeral pyre. The 27-ton machine, their beast slayer, their home, had turned into a gigantic, roaring torch. Tongues of flame shot out from every crevice. The turret, ripped from its ring, flew several dozen meters into the air and crashed down nearby. They had survived, burned, concussed, at the very limit of human endurance, but alive. Orlov tried to lift his head. The world was spinning. The sky was red from the glow of fires. The battle had already rolled further west. All around stood the hulks of other burned-out tanks, both theirs and the enemy's. They were alone on this field of death. He looked at his men. Petrenko and Zubov were unconscious. Their bodies were covered in horrific burns. Kovalyov was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth, humming something to himself. He was smiling, a terrible, insane smile. Medics found them at dusk, 4 charred bodies next to the smoldering hulk of a self-propelled gun. At first they thought they were dead, but then one of them moaned. The salvation they had dreamed of for 5 long, endless hours had come. But this was only the beginning of another journey. A journey back to the civilized world, which, as it turned out, was not ready to accept their terrible truth. Their euphoria at being rescued quickly gave way to a collision with the soulless machine of war. In the field hospital, among hundreds of other wounded, their story sounded like the ramblings of a madman. 5 hours? In a burning vehicle? The doctor, a tired man with eyes red from lack of sleep, listened to Orlov, nodded, but his eyes showed disbelief. "Heatstroke, concussion," he wrote in the medical file. "It happens." Their feat, their incredible survival, was reduced to a simple medical formula. After the hospital, an interrogation by the special department awaited them. A young, dapper lieutenant with cold eyes listened to their story with open skepticism. "So you're saying the hatches were jammed?" he asked for the 10th time. "And you weren't perhaps just trying to sit out the battle in the tank, Comrade Senior Sergeant?" The accusation of cowardice was a blow to Orlov more terrible than any burn. He tried to explain, to prove, but his words shattered against a wall of bureaucratic disbelief. Their story was too incredible, too inconvenient. It didn't fit into the heroic reports of knocked-out German tanks. It was about something else, about suffering, about fear, about survival on the edge. The kind of thing they don't like to write about in the newspapers. A field experiment on a similarly damaged ISU-152 showed that the hatch could indeed jam from a side impact. The charges of cowardice were dropped, but instead of medals, they received orders for the crew to be disbanded and a non-disclosure agreement to sign. Their brotherhood, their family, forged in hell, was destroyed by the stroke of a pen. Their fate was buried alive in folders stamped secret. The fates of the survivors unfolded differently, but each was marked by the invisible seal of that terrible day. 5 hours in a red-hot furnace did not pass without a trace. They survived physically, but a part of their souls remained forever in that burned-out steel box on the Prokhorovka field. Senior Sergeant Alexei Orlov, their commander, their steel spine, was deemed fit for further service after the hospital and investigations. He was given a new crew, a new vehicle. He continued to fight. He fought bravely, desperately, as if seeking death. His comrades said he had changed greatly. His former prudence was gone, replaced by a dark obsession. He never told anyone what they had been through. He was killed in '44 during the liberation of Belarus. His SPG hit a landmine. The official report of his death stated, "Fell a hero's death, fulfilling his military duty." Another line in the endless list of war casualties. Sergeant Ivan Zubov, the engineer whose cold reason gave them a chance, suffered severe burns and was medically discharged. He returned to his native factory in Leningrad. He returned to build tanks again. He worked silently, stubbornly, never complaining. His colleagues respected him for his professionalism, but were wary of his withdrawn nature and strange gaze. He never spoke of the war. Only sometimes, on hot summer days, he couldn't bear to be in the workshop. He would run outside and gasp for air as if suffocating. He died in the early 50s from a heart attack. The doctor said it was the consequences of the war. Starshina Grigory Petrenko, the oldest and most experienced, survived, but his lungs were seared by the toxic fumes. He lived for a few more years after the war, returning to his village, to his daughter. But he could no longer work in the fields. Every breath was a struggle. He often sat on the bench outside his house, staring at the sky and whispering something quietly. The villagers thought him an eccentric. He died on a quiet autumn night, in his sleep. He simply ran out of air. The fate of Private Vasily Kovalyov, the youngest, was the most tragic. His body survived, but his mind was destroyed. The psyche of a 19-year-old boy could not withstand the horror. After the hospital, he was sent to a specialized psychiatric hospital for veterans. He lived there for many years. He recognized no one, hardly spoke. Only sometimes, when the ward became stuffy, he would start screaming, beating against the walls, and repeating the same word over and over. Hot. Hot. For the official history, their crew ceased to exist. Their fate was forgotten, buried under tons of archival paper. The vehicle with the number 312 was listed as a total loss on July 12, 1943, just one of thousands. He was buried in a small village cemetery. A modest obelisk with a star was placed on his grave. But, as the locals told it, sometimes someone would leave strange things by his grave. A burnt gear, a piece of melted vision block. Who brought them and from where? No one knew. Official history is a chronicle of victories and defeats, written by generals and politicians. It dislikes inconvenient details, dislikes stories of suffering that do not fit into the parade picture of heroism. The story of the crew of SPG 312 was exactly that. Too terrifying, too unheroic, too human. It was simply erased, forgotten. But there is another history, the one that lives not in archives, but in the memory of people, the one that is passed down in whispers in smoke-filled rooms, around soldiers' campfires. And the feat of Orlov's crew did not vanish without a trace. It became a legend. It was said that among the tankers of the 5th Guards Tank Army, a tale circulated for a long time. A tale of the burning crew, of 4 brave men who survived a real hell when their vehicle turned into a blast furnace. The details, of course, changed, as they always do with legends. Some said they sat in the fire for a whole day. Others, that they managed to repair the engine from the inside and drive out of the battle in a burning machine. And some swore they had seen the ghost of the burned-out SPG wandering the Prokhorovka field at night, searching for its crew. In these stories, their machine was called the Oven, and that word evoked a superstitious terror and boundless respect among veteran tankers. This story became a myth, a parable about the incredible strength of the human spirit, about how even when you are locked in a steel coffin and being roasted alive, even when all hope is lost, a person is capable of fighting. Fighting not for the motherland, not for Stalin, but for a single, solitary breath of fresh air. For the right to live. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was a life bought at the price of burned lungs, a broken mind, and eternal fear worth those 5 hours in hell? There's no answer to that question. But their story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder. A reminder that behind every line in the war reports, behind every number of a knocked-out tank, there are living people, with their own hopes, their own fears, and their own personal tragedies. And the most terrible battles sometimes take place not on the fields of battle, but inside a small, locked steel box, or in the soul of a single man. Their feat was not marked by medals. Their names are not carved on memorial plaques. But as long as the legend of the Oven lives, as long as we tell their story, they are alive. Alexei Orlov, Ivan Zubov, Grigory Petrenko, Vasily Kovalyov, the crew that lived for 5 hours in hell and returned to become immortal. Write in the comments what you think of this story, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history.